Hello, listeners, and welcome to Higher Level History. I'm Professor Carthel. This podcast is a companion to the American Yawp online textbook, and the idea is simple. Each episode, we step behind the chapter to find the stories worth telling. We're going to slow down on the moments worth slowing down on, follow the people the textbook can only mention in passing, and ask the questions that make history feel less like a subject and more like a story. Let's get into it. Chapter 6 of the American Yawp is called The American Revolution, and it is, without question, the biggest chapter you've read so far. Stamp Act, Townsend Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, the Declaration, Yorktown. It's a lot of ground, and the Yawp covers it all. This is the spine of the whole American story, the one most of us think we already know. So today, I want to start somewhere a little different. I want to start with something most Americans believe they understand perfectly. Something we were taught as children that shows up in textbooks and documentaries and 4th of July speeches. The Boston Massacre. You know the image. British soldiers lined up, firing without provocation into a crowd of unarmed colonists. 5 dead. Crispus Attucks, the first martyr of American liberty, a tyrannical empire showing its true face. That image has done a lot of work in American memory. It's one of the reasons the revolution feels, to most of us, like a patriotic story of good versus evil, tyranny on one side, liberty on the other. Now, I'm not here today to tell you that story is a lie. However, I am here to ask you to set it down for 20 minutes, the way one man in Boston was legally and professionally required to set it down in the winter of 1770. His name was John Adams. And what he did with that image when it was his job to look past it is one of the most important stories this chapter has to offer. The morning after that fateful massacre took the lives of 5 Americans on King Street, a man came to John Adams' door in tears. His name was James Forrest. He was a Boston merchant, an Irishman, and by his own account, he had not slept. He told Adams he had come on behalf of a man currently sitting in a jail cell, awaiting whatever Boston intended to do with him. Captain Thomas Preston, the British officer who had led his soldiers into a crowd on King Street the night before, and who was now, as far as most of the city was concerned, a murderer. Forrest had already been turned away by every other lawyer he tried. Nobody in Boston wanted their name attached to this case. "I am come with a very solemn message from a very unfortunate man," Forrest told him. "Captain Preston in prison. He wishes for counsel and can get none." Adams was 34 years old. He was a patriot and not a quiet one. He wrote columns against British policy under a pseudonym. His own cousin ran the Sons of Liberty. His wife Abigail was pregnant. And the case sitting in front of him was the most politically toxic thing a Boston lawyer could touch. He agreed to it anyway. To understand why, you have to go back to the night itself, because the version most of us carry around is not quite what the courtroom would later establish. It was the 5th of March, 1770. Cold, with snow still on the ground. A British sentry was standing watch outside the customs house on King Street alone, when a small group of young men started in on him. Insults first, then snowballs. The details get messier from there. Some witnesses describe oyster shells and ice. Some describe clubs. Some describe a crowd chanting for the soldier to be killed. A bell rang out, the kind Boston used to signal fire, and that brought more people running. By the time a small detachment of British soldiers arrived to back up the sentry, there was a crowd pressing in around 8 frightened young men holding loaded muskets. Someone shouted, Nobody at the trial could agree exactly who, or even what the word actually was. Nonetheless, the soldiers fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 Bostonians were dead or dying. One of them was Crispus Attucks, a dock worker who had once been enslaved. Boston had its martyrs, and now they wanted blood. The next part is the piece of the story most people never hear: the trial. John Adams agreed to defend Preston first, and then the 8 soldiers after him. He did it on a simple principle, one he wrote down for himself before he ever stepped into a courtroom.
Counsel ought to be the very last thing an accused person should want in a free country.
The soldiers' trial opened in late November. Over more than a week, more than 40 witnesses took the stand. And one piece of testimony mattered more than any other. The man's name was Patrick Carr. He was an Irish immigrant, a leathersmith, and he had been the last man shot that night. He did not die immediately. He lingered for 9 days, long enough for his surgeon, a man named John Jeffries, to sit and talk with him. On the afternoon before he died, Carr told Dr. Jeffries something extraordinary. He said he had grown up in Ireland. He had seen mobs there. He had seen soldiers called out to put them down, and he had seen those soldiers open fire on crowds before. He had never in his life seen soldiers show as much restraint as the men on King Street had shown that night before they finally fired. And then he said this: he forgave the soldier who shot him. He believed the man held no malice. He believed he had fired only to defend himself. A dying man, shot by the very soldiers on trial, used what may have been his last clear afternoon to tell the truth as he understood it, rather than the story Boston wanted to hear. Adams built his closing argument on testimony like Carr's. He did not ask the jury to forget what happened. He asked them to look at it without the passions of the memory attached.
Facts are stubborn things,
He told them.
and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence.
He went further than that. He told the jury plainly that there had, in fact, been a mob on King Street that night, and that calling it anything softer would be giving it more respect than it deserved. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted outright. 2, the 2 whose muskets could be tied directly to the deaths, were convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter. Their punishment was a hot iron branded into the base of their thumbs. Witnesses said both men wept before it was done. Adams had just defended the most hated men in Boston and won. Years later, an old man looking back over an extraordinary life, John Adams wrote about this case. Not the Continental Congress, not the Declaration, not his presidency, but this case. He wrote,
The part I took in defense of Captain Preston and the soldiers procured me anxiety enough. It was, however, one of the most gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered to my country.
I want to ponder on that for a second because it's genuinely strange. The most famous lawyer of the American Revolution, a man who would go on to help write the Declaration of Independence and become the second president of the United States, looked back across his entire career and pointed to this case. Defending the soldiers everyone hated, not because he loved Britain, because he believed a free country had to prove it could give even its enemies a fair trial, especially when giving them one cost something. Now look at what the Yawp itself tells you. If you read it closely, The chapter describes the crowd that night as people who began hurling insults, snowballs, and perhaps more. Perhaps more. That phrase is doing a lot of quiet work. It is the textbook's way of acknowledging, without quite saying it, that the popular memory of this night and the documented reality of this night are not the same things. The chapter has to keep moving, so it moves. We, however, do not have to. This matters for more than just one night in Boston, because the pattern is everywhere in this chapter once you start looking for it. Stamp distributors burned in effigy, a lieutenant governor's house torn apart by a crowd in one evening, a customs officer stripped, tarred, and forced to drink scalding hot liquid while a noose hung visibly behind him. Committees of inspection formed specifically to monitor neighbors and publish the names of anyone who failed to comply so they could be, in the Continental Congress's own words, publicly known and universally condemned as the enemies of American liberty. None of this makes the colonists' grievances illegitimate. Taxation without representation was a real principle, but the way that principle got enforced, on the ground and in the streets, again and again, was not petitions and pamphlets. It was intimidation. It was violence aimed at fellow colonists who hesitated or disagreed. That is the part of this revolution most of us were never taught to notice, because it complicates the story we like the way it is. What makes John Adams remarkable is that he was given the chance to lean into that comfortable story at the exact moment it would have made him a hero in Boston, and he refused. He looked at men his neighbors wanted dead and insisted on asking what had actually happened before deciding what they deserved. The instinct toward violence that runs through this chapter, and that will keep running through the chapters ahead of us, did not start in 1775 with muskets at Lexington. It was already here, years earlier, in a Boston crowd convinced that some people's lives mattered enough to protect, and others did not. Adams spent the rest of his life believing that the willingness to slow down, even once, even when it cost you something, is what separates a free country from a mob with better branding. Everything we've talked about so far happened in Boston among colonists arguing about what liberty meant for people who already had it. In today's special segment, I want to take you to South Carolina to look at what liberty meant to someone who had none. His name was Boston King. He was born enslaved around 1760 on a plantation near Charleston. As a teenager, he was trained as a house servant, then apprenticed out to learn carpentry. By his own account, the people he was forced to serve treated him with real cruelty, and at 16, after a punishment he believed he did not deserve, he made a decision that could have gotten him killed. In 1780, when British troops occupied Charleston, Boston King ran. Not north, not into the woods, but toward the British Army. He wrote about that decision later in a memoir published in London in 1798. "To escape his cruelty," he wrote, "I determined to go to Charlestown and throw myself into the hands of the English." What he found there surprised him. "They received me readily, and I began to feel the happiness of liberty, of which I knew nothing before, although I was much grieved at first to be obliged to leave my friends and reside among strangers." A man who lived his entire life enslaved did not know what the word liberty meant until the moment he crossed into a British camp. Not because the British cared about him. Lord Dunmore's proclamation and the policy that followed it across the southern colonies offered freedom to enslaved people for one practical reason. It weakened the patriot cause and strengthened the British war effort. It was a military strategy wearing the clothing of a moral one. But Boston King did not have the luxury of caring about British motives. He had a chance and he took it. His path from there was not simple, nor was it safe. He served the British Army as a carpenter. He once carried a critical dispatch through enemy lines that saved 250 British soldiers from an ambush. He was captured by the Americans and enslaved again. And then he escaped a second time. By the end of the war, an estimated 30,000 to 100,000 enslaved people had done some version of what Boston King did. Run toward an army that did not love them, because that army was the only force on the continent willing to say, even cynically, that they should be free. When the British finally evacuated New York in 1783, the peace treaty technically required them to leave formerly enslaved people behind, to be returned to the men who claimed to own them. The British command, to their credit, largely refused. Boston King and thousands like him were listed in a document called the Book of Negroes, and evacuated to Nova Scotia as free people. He became a Methodist preacher there. In 1792, he joined an expedition of black Nova Scotians sailing for a new colony in West Africa, a place called Sierra Leone, built specifically as a home for formerly enslaved people. He became the first Methodist missionary on that coast. His wife, Violet, died of fever within a month of their arrival, but he kept preaching anyway for the rest of his life. Boston King never marched with the Continental Army. He was not in the story most of us were taught about how liberty came to America. But he understood something about that word more intimately and arguably more honestly than most of the men arguing about it in Philadelphia that same summer. For Boston King, liberty did not arrive through a declaration. It arrived through a decision to run at 16 toward the people on the continent willing to make him an offer. When you open Chapter 6 of the American Yawp, you're going to move very quickly. But I want you to read it a little differently than you might have otherwise. Watch the language. Every time the chapter says popular protest or resistance, or notes almost in passing that the war in the South was truly a civil war, slow down. Ask what is sitting underneath that phrase. Ask who was doing what to whom and why the chapter chose the word that it used. And when you reach the section on Lord Dunmore's proclamation, don't just read it as a British strategy. Try to imagine the calculation on the other side of it. Thousands of people weighing a promise they had every reason to doubt against a life they already knew was unbearable, and choosing the promise anyway. Chapter 6 of the American Yawp is available for free at americanyawp.com. Read it alongside this episode, not instead of it. I'm Professor Carthel, and this has been Higher Level History. That wraps up this episode of Higher Level History with Professor Carthel. Don't forget to check the episode description for full music and sound clip licensing information. If you have any questions or simply want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to me at prof.carthel@higherlevelhistory.com. And if you haven't already, head over to theamericanyawp.com to access your free online copy of the American Yawp textbook. The podcast and the textbook work best together. Higher Level History is an independent educational resource and is not affiliated with any academic institution. Until next time, I'm Professor Carthel.